Welcome back to TarHeelIllustrated.com. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel, Tar Heel Illustrated, I'm THI staff writer Jacob Turner. And joining me, as he so often does, our very own publisher, Andrew Jones. Andrew, we're here for part two of the series we're doing on the Carolina football program. If you haven't seen the first one, make sure you go and watch that one. We did that on the returning guys, the seniors that are coming back to next year's team. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on the offense, a little bit of a look back on what they did this season and kind of looking ahead to 2021 as well. AJ, I'm going to go ahead and run through some stats with this offense. It just kind of shows how prolific they were this season. Number 5 total offense in the country, 537.2 yards per game, 6,447 yards on the season, which right now is the most of any team in the country. I know Alabama was like right behind them. Obviously, Alabama's had quite a handful of games where they probably played their second string the entire second half. So got to take that with a grain of salt. And obviously, Alabama has another game to play, so they'll probably end up surpassing Carolina regardless. But still shows how good this Carolina offense has been, was this season, I should say. AJ, let's talk about we could run through these stats all day. I mean, Sam Howell had an impressive year. Michael Carter, Javonte Williams both ran over 1,000 yards. Yami Brown had another 1,000-yard season receiving. What are your thoughts overall on how this offense did? Did they meet kind of the expectations you had, exceed them at all, maybe not meet the expectations you had? What are your just overall thoughts from what you thought this offense could be going into the season to how they ended up being?
Well, to answer the question of did they meet expectations, it first must be noted that the expectations were extremely high.
Very high.
Because they had 2,000-yard receivers last year that were back. They had a 1,000-yard rusher in Michael Carter who was back, and Javonte had 933 yards. And, of course, Sam. So they had that core back, and everyone expected them to be better, and they were. Mm-hmm. Daz didn't have the same season. I think that I think when that stretch when Bo went out, when they lost Bo, I think that affected Daz a little bit. Mm-hmm. Teams defended him. I don't really have an explanation for why Daz's numbers were down a little bit, but he did close strong. He did, right? And I think by and large, the offense as a whole was better. It was historic. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that this wasn't the best offense that Carolina's ever had. Yeah. It was certainly close if it wasn't. I knew 2015 was a really good offense. Mm-hmm. But this group was amazing, and they were very good in the red zone. I think the area that they improved the most was converting tight, short yardage situations, mm-hmm. and then scoring touchdowns in the red zone and rushing touchdowns in the red zone. Last year, they didn't have many. They had a lot more this year. They were in the top 10 in the nation in touchdowns in the red zone percentage. Not just the numbers, but the percentage as well. So that's something that people wondered, will Phil Longo offenses score touchdowns when they get in the red zone? The critique before was that closer they got to the goal line, the harder it was for them to score because all that eye candy spread stuff, maybe too much finesse and not enough grit. Mm-hmm. Well, that offensive line grinded. They had running backs that could. Javonte bowled people over going into the end zone. Sam had 5 rushing touchdowns. I think that a lot of the play calling in those situations was really good. I know people are going to pinpoint a few, like in Charlottesville, that weren't. But if you expect perfection, then when you're looking at athletes and you're looking at coaches, you're looking at the wrong place for that. Yeah. And then if you look at sports writers for it, perfection doesn't really exist. Mm-hmm. So there are going to be things to kind of pick on if you want to. But the reasons those little things stand out is because everything else went right. Mm-hmm. The offense was awesome. The offense was fantastic. Sam grew in the role of not just being a quarterback who gets the ball around, but being a vocal quarterback, being a guy who kind of is a little bit more the engine of the offense. And I think we'll see next year Sam absolutely will be that guy, growing more into the role of leader, which I don't know if it came naturally to him or not. He wasn't very talkative last year, but just if you see his interviews with us, says a lot more now than he did last year. And I've told you a million times, and people who watch our videos know I've said this a million times. One of my very favorite things about doing this for a living is watching kids come in as freshmen and they give very short answers. Yeah, and when they're sophomores, they give longer answers. And by the time they leave, they can turn around and do the interview themselves.
Exactly.
And Sam is trending in that direction. I think it's important because he's got to be the guy in the locker room that people hear. Mm-hmm. And I think he became more of that guy. So we know what he can do throwing. We know he can read defenses. We know he can go through his progression. We know he makes tremendous decisions with the RPOs. The next step for him is being more of a leader, especially now that De'Ami's gone and Michael Carter, who was the loudest voice in that room this year, he's gone. Javonte wasn't a loud voice, but he was a loud presence. Yeah. He was a big presence. There was a glow above Javonte wherever he went. Sam's going to have to take on a lot of that himself next year, especially early, while guys establish themselves. And I think we saw Sam trend in that direction. And the offensive line was really good. The pass blocking in the 4 losses, they gave up 20 sacks. So that's something that will be addressed in the offseason. But the run blocking got better against good defenses. The run blocking, they didn't get a lot of yards rushing against Texas A&M, but I thought the line did a little bit better job than maybe they did against Notre Dame. And I think maybe A&M's front was even better. And they still have some room to grow, but they got all those guys back. And, when Brian Anderson was better the second half of the year than he was the first half of the year, he still needs to be more consistent. But you got to like what you saw from the offense, and getting Bo back and getting Garrett Walston back is huge. So, we could talk forever about how good the offense was, but I think it's important to note that I think the offense can keep going at a comparable level next year with the parts they have coming back, especially getting Bo and Garrett back. That's huge. The offensive line is back. And I think the receiving core is going to be fine. It's just going to take a while before guys fully establish their roles and what they can do, and fans get used to Josh Downs and Joffrey Brown running into the end zone instead of Daz and De'Ami Brown. And they're going to have to figure out the running back situation. That's the one question mark I really have going moving forward. That's a really, really long answer for your one question.
No, you're good, man. It was a perfect
touched all the boxes there.
Exactly. That you handled it for me. That's a perfect segue into kind of what I wanted to go ahead and kind of look forward, because season's over at this point. The offense had a really, I don't think anybody's going to disagree that the offense was very good this season. Even statistically proven too. It's just not an opinion or our take on what went on. It's statistically a fact that Carolina's offense is one of the best in the country. Let's go ahead and look ahead. You mentioned that running game. I want to talk about that running back room. You got to replace 2 guys, Michael Carter and Javonte Williams, who had 1,000-yard rushing seasons. Both of them did this season. Michael Carter also had it last year. So he had back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons. You expect both of those guys to play at the next level at some capacity. You also got to replace a guy in Javonte Williams who had 19, 20 touchdowns on the season. He was just a beast when it came to in the red zone in terms of finishing drives off and whatnot. So I think the running back room is one of the biggest question marks going into next year. You got some young guys who've done it. DJ Jones showed some flashes against Western before he got hurt. Elijah Green did the same. But then you kind of look at that Texas A&M, the Orange Bowl. British Brooks, Josh Henderson come in. What did they rush for? I think 90 yards. It wasn't.
Well, and remember, Sam was a big part of the running game.
Yeah, and Sam had, I think, over 20 of those as well. So you look at kind of where that situation is right now. It's kind of up for debate whether or not those guys are going to be able to come in next year and kind of fill the role that Michael and Javonte did. They're obviously huge shoes to fill, but based on what we saw in that bowl game, and granted they were playing the number 5 team in the country, they're not going to come up against a team that good and that physical on the defensive line every week in the ACC. But still, where Mac's trying to take this program, you need guys like Javonte and Michael who can come in and do it against any team in the country. So what are your thoughts on kind of that room going into next year? Because like I mentioned, that for me is kind of the biggest question mark or concern, if you will, that I have kind of for this offense.
Well, I think to what you just said, it was against the number 5 team in the country, but the stated mission of this program is to beat this team.
Yeah, it's to beat this.
So
exactly.
They might be okay with British Brooks and Josh Henderson and Elijah Green and DJ Jones against Duke, against State, against Wake, and that kind of thing. And I'm not demeaning those programs, but I think you kind of get my point here. What are they going to do when they go to South Bend next year?
Yeah,
what are they going to do if they get to the ACC championship game in Clemson, who had a young defensive front, when they're sitting there waiting for them, or if they get into another Orange Bowl situation or more? They've got to have the composition that can handle that, and I don't know if that room gives them that right now. So, Mac did say that they're going to look into the portal, and that there are positions of need. I think running back is certainly. You don't have to be a rocket scientist or Newt Rockne to understand that that's a position of need. And if there's a guy that can make them better,
You got to get him.
And he wants to go to Carolina, and they want him, and everything works out as far as transferring over, then I think that that's the kind of thing that could happen. So I would keep an eye on the portal. It would not surprise me if an experienced running back in another major program from another conference, perhaps maybe the SEC, would end up being in that running back room and maybe even the starter. And remember, everybody gets the year back. So whoever they get could be someone who's got a couple of years left.
Exactly.
And they have something to sell. Javonte and Michael split carries.
I know.
They don't run the ball 30 times a game to get to their 1,000 yards. They split carries, and they're both going second and third round. So that whole offensive line's back. There are dudes knocking on the door, and there are other guys that might be having back channel communication right now that are interested and want to learn more before they kind of maybe enter the portal and make themselves available to a program like a Carolina. So I think when you look at that room, I would imagine that there will be an addition. That's my guess, is that there will be an addition to that room. But even if there's not, we didn't see a lot of the other guys. I like the glimpses we saw from DJ Jones. Elijah Green didn't play in the Orange Bowl. Didn't really expect him to after hearing what Mac and Longo were saying about him. He played in the high school offense that basically ran the ball all the time. So he had to learn pass pro, and you cannot stick a kid out there against that Texas A&M defense that is not yet ready with pass protection. So do not surprise me he didn't play. But now he's got 8 months in the whole spring practice, which those kids didn't have last year, to improve in those areas. So moving forward, I think the key really is going to be the running back room. They're going to be really, really good everywhere else.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to be 2020 good everywhere else, in my opinion. I think they're going to be fantastic, maybe even better. The offensive line should get better. It's the running back room that'll be the big question, and it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out, because right now I could guess on what the order would be based on who's still in that room. Well, I don't know for sure. I would think DJ Jones might be the front of that room.
Yeah, I would kind of think so too.
But again, there's not a lot of intel to go by. So that's going to be the giant question mark hanging over this program and this offense until they get on the field and play games. Even if they go get somebody, there's no guarantee that guy will have a lot of success.
Exactly. I mean, it's not guaranteed. Like you said, you just never know even if you reach into the transfer portal and get a guy that's got experience and that's done it, and you never know how they're going to transition to a new program and a new coaching staff and a new offense. You just never know. But AJ,
guys transfer, and Mac has told us, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mac told us so many times, look, guys transfer for a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't transfer because they're super happy and playing a ton. Every once in a while, there are personal reasons kids transfer, like when not Kyler Michael, but Cameron Kelly left Auburn to go to Carolina. There were some family situations there. That does happen. And maybe that'll be the case ultimately with whoever they bring in, if they bring in somebody. But so it's not a cure, but I do think they'll get somebody else that will enhance that room, make it more competitive, and give the staff another option, and maybe be a guy who could be a go-to player.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, if you're a running back across the country, I mean, with what Carolina's on the up and up right now and how they finished this year, I mean, it's an exciting thing to come into. Yeah, especially when you consider you're getting, Sam Howell and returning the whole line. AJ, let's talk about the wide receiver core. Then we'll talk about the offensive line to wrap this thing up. Wide receiver core, we talked about in the previous podcast we did in terms of Bo Corrales returning. Obviously, that's a big plus. You also got tight end Garrett Walston, who's coming back to the program. So two experienced guys are going to obviously help in that wide receiver room, not in terms of only just their production on the field, but just kind of in terms of their leadership and just being around the program when you consider how young both the tight end and the wide receiver position room are. Let's focus on some of the other guys there. You got like Sachafi Brown. Had a big game in the Orange Bowl, also had some big games. Boston College comes to mind with that slant across the middle that he took for God knows how many yards for a touchdown. They've got guys like that. Josh Downs played really well in the Orange Bowl. We start to see glimpses of these guys step up when they've been called upon. Overall, I think this wide receiver room is, you're obviously losing Diami and Daz, who, I mean, just two big losses. I mean, especially Diami back-to-back 1,000-yard receiving seasons. Daz didn't have quite the year he had this year, but he's still a really good slot receiver that had 1,000 yards receiving in the previous year. So you're losing two experienced guys that have done it. But I think overall, if you're kind of looking at this offense, especially when you consider how good Sam Howell is and then he's coming back, I think you're not too worried about this wide receiver core as a whole. I think there's a lot of positives and a lot of kind of excitement going into next season, a lot of optimism for some of these young guys to step up and take their chance.
Daz said that Josh Downs is kind of like him.
Yeah, I'd probably
And
agree.
there's some truth to that. I don't know if he's faster or not, but he certainly stretched the field. He got behind the DB for Texas A&M. I like that you mentioned Chaffrey's play against BC. How about the one against Virginia?
Yep.
You know, Chaffrey, I think Chaffrey's going to be really good.
I think he is.
And I know that when we cover recruiting extensively, and there were people that thought that Chaffrey was a better prospect than Diami.
I say it
He's a little longer, a little bigger. He's got stride.
Might be fast.
He kind of fits the suit maybe a little bit more than Diami. And, he had that drop in the Orange Bowl.
Yeah, it was a big drop.
And all I could think about was I saw Diami drop those too before.
Yeah. Did we?
He worked on it, and he used those as lessons to get better. And he turned himself into a fantastic college wide receiver. I think Chaffrey has a chance to put up similar kind of numbers, but really being a great target for Sam. And he's a guy who could go over the middle, like I said, because he's longer. Yeah. And that drop against A&M, that's going to fuel him for the offseason.
Oh, 100%.
It's going to fuel him for the offseason, and I think he's going to be really, really good. I like some of the options they have with some of the other guys. I know that Justin Olsen got some snaps in the Orange Bowl. They kind of like him. He's sort of a dude that was kind of under the radar when he came in. Now people talked about him. I think he could be in the mix, and they've got some freshmen coming in. Gavin Blackwell is going to be an early enrollee. We'll be able to see what he can do. Ray Rose spent most of the year just kind of learning. We'll get an opportunity to see what he can do. I think Emery Simmons got a ton of snaps this year and learned how to be a good blocking receiver. And I think he could be a guy that can help them out a lot next year. He could get possession balls. He could get down the field, get behind defenders. So I think the wide receiver group's going to be in really, really good shape next year. They're not going to be an issue. And, of course, having Bo back, if you want to throw Garrett Walston in there, you got 109 receptions and 15 touchdowns back with those two.
Yeah, that's a huge plus. And then also kind of on top of that, I know Sam Howell mentioned it after the Miami game, after the Texas A&M, the Orange Bowl, that he was looking forward to working with some of those receivers. You kind of look at them, where's Chaffrey Brown? Where's Sam Howell from Charlotte? Where's Chaffrey Brown from Charlotte? Justin Olsen, Charlotte. Gavin Blackwell, Charlotte. So you got those guys that are going to kind of be able to work together in the offseason. We know how much Diami and Sam spent together, and I'm sure Chaffrey was involved in that as well this offseason. So will you just consider where some of Sam Howell's top targets are even from in the state of North Carolina? They're all from kind of the same area. So you do expect a lot of that grind to go in the offseason. That's a big plus for this team as a whole. Let's talk about the O-line before we wrap it up. O-line is, everybody's coming back. That's huge. The one thing Mac Brown talked about earlier this week, or I should say last week now, about kind of the group as a whole was we've got the guys there. We've got a guy like Ed Montilus who's coming back, who was injured a lot this year and didn't play a lot, which obviously affected the depth of the O-line as a group. But Mac's biggest concern, based on what he said, is the guys after that. Who's going to come in if somebody goes down? Who's going to come in and kind of relieve those guys if they need some snaps off? But obviously, looking at the O-line just from the starters, you're returning everybody, and that is a huge plus, especially when you kind of consider the O-line, especially over the last couple games in particular. After that kind of Notre Dame beatdown, where I kind of think they came back down to earth a little bit, played a little bit better against Miami, played a little bit better against A&M in terms of protecting Sam. So I think this O-line has a lot of positives and a lot of optimism going into next year, and it's going to be one of the strongest groups. But like Mac mentioned, you got to have some guys that can step up and relieve some of those guys and step in if they need to.
They have several potential NFL guys, but you've got to be able to protect the quarterback.
Yeah.
Better than they have to be. I think Azu is a guy that very well could be in the league.
Yeah.
When you look at McKeithen, he just screams at you, NFL.
Okay.
But, if Tucker and McKeithen and Azu are NFL guys, then the offensive line shouldn't be giving up 5 sacks and losses.
No way.
So the pass protection is going to be a major point of emphasis. That's going to be a big point of emphasis in the spring, and it needs to get corrected in the spring. They need to be much better. As run blockers, I think they graded out very, very well. They had two starting offensive linemen that graded out under 50 for the season in PFF.
Not great.
And Brian Anderson and Austin Richards were just under 50. There was some inconsistency there. Anderson won Offensive Lineman of the Week, I think, after the Virginia Tech game and the state game. Yeah. And he had some positives. He did a nice job calling stuff. He grew into that position, but they need him to be more consistent. They need Richards to be more consistent. They've got to cut down on the false starts. So there's definitely room for improvement for the line. And as far as the depth, you bring up a great point, and it is certainly maybe the other issue with the offense. They've got to develop some depth there. Getting Montilus back, having him healthy, will be huge because you may be bell guy some, is the way Azudu can move around. Montless can also play a couple of different positions on the line. They need to find a backup center. I don't know if it's Adorno. I don't really know who it's going to be.
Yeah.
They've had some attrition in that group, which seems to always be the case with the offensive line. There's a lot of attrition in the offensive line. It's the one position group that's guaranteed basically helmet-to-helmet contact in almost every snap.
Yeah.
So there's going to be attrition. But they have a lot of young linemen in the program. They didn't go out and get a whole lot of offensive linemen in this recruiting class. So some of those kids need to make progress and need to step up. They want to go 8 deep. They've got to be able to go 8 deep. If they want to be the team next year, they think they can be. And that's one that goes to Charlotte for the ACC championship and goes toe-to-toe with Clemson. They can't do it with just the starting offensive line. You've got to be fortified in the 6, 7, and 8 spots as well. The run game has to be better. The O-line has to be better. Those guys we talk about in the wide receiver group, they have to emerge the way we're saying we think that they will. All that has to happen in order to be that team.
Mm-hmm. So overall, before we close this thing out, going into next year, obviously we talked about last year, really good season offensively. Going into next year, pretty optimistic about, this offense putting up being able to put up similar numbers, maybe even better than they did last season. Obviously the running back room is a big question mark, and who's going to be that guy that on the receiving core that they can maybe get over 1,000 receiving yards. But overall, I think seems like to me it's a pretty exciting thing when you return the whole O-line, a couple of receivers, and Sam Howell on top of that, who's one of the best quarterbacks in the country. I mean, you got to be pretty optimistic going into next season, I would think.
I would think UNC fans would be very, very optimistic, especially when they see what ends up what that running back room looks like. In a week from now, we might know a lot more.
Exactly.
January 19th, when the players are, start doing their all-season conditioning workouts and stuff, we should know what the running back, or you would like to know what the running back look like. They would rather have someone in then so they can have them in the spring. But I think the offense can be very, very good. I don't know if they'll put up the per game numbers they did this year. That's a lot to ask. But I think the defense will be better. We'll hit the defense on the next video. And they may not have to score. They had to score 59 points to beat Wake Forest. They had to score, 56 points to beat Virginia Tech. If the defense is better, the offense won't have to do those things maybe next year. I don't know if we'll see anything different from the offense, but I think the offense can be at 90% of what it was this past season, and the team actually be better and win more games because the defense, I think, should be much, much better and much more consistent. And we'll address that, like I said, in the next video. So I don't know. It's a lot to ask for the offense to be just as good. Yeah. I think that they could be explosive, but we got to see what the running back room is going to look like before I can make any declarative statements on that front. But I do think 90% of what they were, 85%, 90% of what they were, is reasonable to expect. And that would be really, really good. Because let's remember where the offense was in 17 and 18.
Come along.
Let's remember where most offenses are. Even if they're 85 or 90%, they would still be a top 25 offense. And you can compete for national stuff if you have a top 25 offense, provided you have a really good defense too.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I think you got to get that running back room filled out. You got to see who's going to step up kind of at that wide receiver position. And you just never know what could happen during a year. I mean, you get one O lineman or, a receiver going down early in the season through injury, and it can kind of mess up your whole momentum and the flow of the offense. But I think overall, it's going to be tough to replicate what this team's done this year in terms of 537 yards per game. But if you can just get, some of that, you're going to be fine, especially when you consider how many guys the defense has coming back, which we'll be touching on in the next video. So stay tuned for that as we release that over the next couple of days. But as always, guys, AJ, thanks for joining me, man. We're going to go ahead and wrap this thing up. As always, guys, if you've enjoyed the video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks.